Oh, Sophia, I couldn't see you, but there you are. There's just other videos in between.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. We're just waiting. We've got a lot of people signed up and we're just waiting for people to have time to join. Get started in a minute.
Are you excited for this talk, Sophie?
I am. I am. Anybody who tells me what the trees are saying, I like to hear from. So that's like pretty good. And also, I just love the whole concept of the fish and the forest being connected, the trees and the fish and the whole indigenous history there as well. So it's very exciting.
Yeah, it was a great book. I read the whole thing. I sort of had looked at it before and read parts of it, but then I read the whole thing over last week in preparation for this, and I really enjoyed it. It was such a beautiful arc from coast to coast and old forest to old forest, and a lot of the sort of symmetries of what's been happening in the forest. So really enjoyed it. Highly recommend to anyone in the audience who has not read it yet.
Yeah, just such a good writer. Well, probably just give folks another minute. A lot going on tonight, but we're really happy to be here and to have avoided most of the snow that a lot of our listening area got in the last couple of days. We have a ton of snow in Vermont, but we didn't get this last storm in the northern Vermont anyway.
I saw pictures from southern New Hampshire and Massachusetts, New York, Boston, lots and lots of snow. Good night to stay in and hang out for a webinar.
That's all right, exactly.
I think it is supposed to be pretty cold here tonight. I think the low in this part of the world in central Vermont is 0 tonight. So
Yeah, it felt like 0 when I walked home from work tonight, but I
another good reason
don't
to
think it
stay in and
actually
watch a
was.
webinar.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should just get going here. People can still trickle in, but we want to get started close to time. So, welcome everyone. I'm Sophie Earhart. This is Shelby Perry. I'm the Vermont Land Steward for Northeast Wilderness Trust, and it's my pleasure to join you tonight to hear from our speaker, Lynda Mapes, about what the trees are saying and to learn about the salmon forests. Shelby and I and everyone at NEWT are grateful to have Lynda participating in our speaker series. And we're thrilled to have so many curious guests in the audience to join the conversation. So thanks for being here. For any guests who aren't familiar with Northeast Wilderness Trust, we sometimes call ourselves NEWT. We were founded nearly a quarter of a century ago to fill a niche in the land trust arena. We are the only regional land trust that works exclusively on rewilding. Our mission is to conserve forever wild landscapes for nature and people. We have an eco-centric focus. We're guided by the belief that nature and all our wild cousins have intrinsic value, independent of any value we may or may not ascribe to them from our human perspective. We just reached an important milestone at NEWT. We now conserve as Forever Wild more than 100,000 acres across northeastern New York and New England. And I want to just acknowledge and thank all of you who support and champion rewilding. Many of the people in our audience tonight are part of a much larger community of rewilding fans who ensure that our work can continue strong into the future. This slide is a little plug for our Forever Wild Circle, of which I'm a member. I know Shelby's a member. I see her in the bandanas. And you can see this year's beautiful bandana that is available to people who contribute through that initiative. As I'm sure you know, revenue streams help us protect salmon streams as well as other habitat. So thank you to everyone who keeps both of those kinds of streams healthy and running. In a few moments, we'll be joined by our presenter, but first I have a couple of housekeeping points to go through with you. First of all, if you have any issues with Zoom during the webinar, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to let us know, and we'll try to help you sort it out. The chat has been disabled, so just use the Q&A button. Second, the format for tonight's webinar will be first, nature journalist and author Lynda Mapes has a presentation and beautiful slides to share with us. Following her presentation, Lynda will be joined by Shelby Perry on your screen now for a conversation about old growth forests. Then we'll expand the conversation to include questions from you, the virtual audience. Please submit your questions using that same Q&A button. The webinar hosts will see your questions, and we'll do our best to ask the presenters as many as possible, which they will answer verbally, but they won't be typing answers to questions in the Q&A. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our two panelists for tonight. Can I see you, Lynda? Are you here? There we are. Author and journalist Lynda V. Mapes specializes in coverage of the environment and indigenous cultures and governments. Over the course of her 27-year career as a reporter at the Seattle Times, she earned numerous awards, including twice in 2012 and again in 2019, winning the International Kavli Gold Award for Science Journalism from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the world's largest professional science association. She and a team of journalists at the Seattle Times were finalists for the 2025 Pulitzer Prize for local reporting. She has written 7 books, including most recently The Trees Are Speaking, Dispatches from the Salmon Forest, just published by the University of Washington Press. Thank you, Shelby. She is winner of the 2021 National Outdoor Book Award and 2021 Washington State Book Award for nonfiction. She is an associate of Harvard Forest and lives in Seattle. Thanks so much for being here, Lynda.
It's a real pleasure, Sophie. What a pleasure to talk to an organization named NEWT.
I know, right? It's a great acronym. We kind of lucked out there.
I couldn't agree more. Welcome everybody tonight, and I'm very jealous of your snow right here in Seattle. It's in the 40s, the grass is green, and the crocuses are in full bloom. So I don't have the wilderness and the wonder that you've got there, but I do have a slideshow for you tonight, and I'm going to get started with that.
Great. Let me. Oh, okay. Go ahead. I was just going to say before you start, I'll introduce Shelby also, and then I'll turn it all over to you. Shelby Perry is director of the Wildlands Ecology program at Northeast Wilderness Trust, an initiative of the trust aimed at conducting, supporting, and sharing ecological research pertaining to wildlands, along with inventorying ecological values on the trust's protected lands. She's a frequent speaker around the Northeast on the topics of wildlands, rewilding, and old forests, and has twice co-taught old forest ecology classes for North Branch Nature Center's Biodiversity University. When not working in them, Shelby can usually be found playing in the woods, in wild forests, exploring them on foot, in snowshoes, or through the lens of her camera. It's a real treat to work with and learn from Shelby, and an honor to introduce her to you tonight. Thanks, Shelby.
Thanks, Sophie. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm really excited to see your talk, Lynda.
And I'm excited for our conversation. So without further ado, I will get into it here. How's that look, everybody? Look good? All right. So this book started for me as an exploration of old growth forests of the Pacific Northwest. And that's the drip line, west of the Cascades, basically from BC, British Columbia, all the way to Northern California. You know, I thought that was going to be the whole of the story, that I would explore these glorious, fantastic trees that we have out here. We have species that can live to fantastic age, such as red cedar, like this one, that can live to be 1,000 years old. Douglas fir, you might call it God's greatest hit. This is a tree that grows fantastically straight, tall, and strong. No branches at all for about the first 50 feet, and all the rest of it is some of the most beautiful lumber you'll ever work with, Douglas fir. And it too can live to be about 1,000 years old. And when I first started out in this journey, I was going to work with Jerry Franklin, pictured here, eminent forest ecologist, and the two of us were going to work together on a book about what the old trees taught him, stories of old growth forests for a general audience. And when he told me about that idea, I thought, that's a great idea, but I also thought you'll never do it. So I suggested to him that we team up. And ultimately, what happened was this book, The Trees Are Speaking. And it actually turned into a very different book than I originally imagined. It really turned out to be a book that's about old growth forest on both sides of the country, in the Pacific Northwest and in New England. And the reason for that is because they're really connected by this commonality of the salmon. These are salmon forests. Now, a lot of people in New England have lost track of that fact, that actually these forests back quite many hundred years ago were full of fish, all kinds of fish, not only salmon, but also herring, a whole suite of life of sea-run fish. And so I wanted to do a book that creates a connected narrative, looks at that beautiful arc of history coast to coast, and tells the story of these old growth forests and salmon as creatures of the forest that are born in these freshwater streams, go out to sea where they gain all their body size, and then come back to the very same place in the forest in these streams where they were born. And it is the trees that make it all possible. And so I'm going to walk through some of these photos with you and explain to you, first of all, what Jerry explained to me, which is why old growth forests are so important and so special and so different, whether we're talking about the trees out here or the trees where you are in New England. So let's start with diversity. It is the beautiful diversity of these forests, from the fungi to a complete understory of all the little native plants that create so much habitat and so much food. It is the trees themselves that have progressed through great age to all kinds of complexity. They're full of holes and cavities, and they're kind of like us, right? Their age shows what they've been through in life. And that adds so much habitat to the forest, because if you're a spider, if you're a bird, if you're a bear, this is where you want to live. You want to snug into one of those cavities for the winter. It is also out here in the Pacific Northwest, the old growth forests are nurtured by abundant moisture. The weather here is perfect for growing plants and trees and moss and lichen. It's mild, it's temperate, and we get a lot of rain. The thing that is common about the old growth forests out here and there, in addition to their diversity of species and plant life, it's the diversity of their structure. It's no one thing, is it? It isn't just big trees. When you're in a true old growth forest that's been allowed to go through all of its changes and its tempos of life, trees dying, trees falling over, leaving open gaps like these sunny patches, that's what we call diversity of structure. And what it means is you have all the age classes present, the very old trees and the new next generation rising. And very importantly, dead and down wood, which is feeding the soil and even providing a nursery for those tiny little trees that are beginning the next generation. And the beauty is both large and small. The beauty is intense, whether it's something like the circinate vernation of this fern, or the grandeur of a tree like this. This is a red cedar in the rainforest of the Pacific Northwest. That thing, you can't tell without a person next to it, but it's about as wide as a garage door. So the immensity, the age, standing at a place like this that basically is so much older than you, there's a beautiful feeling that comes over you, a kind of peace. And look at the light, this green light that you get when everything of the forest is suffused with just that sort of softbox light that you get in a deep old forest. I think one of the things that Jerry Franklin taught me was that I really treasure about the forests out here as well as there is that old growth forests are a thing apart, and there's only one way to get them, and that is with an immensity of time. And that is why clear cuts, he taught me, are so devastating. Because when you simplify a landscape, cutting it all down, as you see in this industrial clear cut on private land, The problem here is that you have simplified the landscape. It is replanted, it's cut to the ground, very often herbicided. Out here, very often replanted in a single monoculture of species. And what you now have is basically farmland. It will never be a natural forest again. And there's often quite a lot of damage. You lose the original soil and its soft structure. You lose a lot of the carbon that's built up over 1,000 years, 600 years, 400 years, and it's all released into the air, creating carbon pollution. And of course, the wildlife. You lose the wildlife, and the trees that have been sheltering the salmon streams are gone. And so, in the Pacific Northwest, we actually enacted a very aggressive preservation plan that protects all of the federal old growth forests, that is, old growth forests on federal land from Washington to Oregon to Northern California. Very ambitious conservation plan, one of the most ambitious ever in the world. And yet, right across the border in BC, we still see this happening. So British Columbia, it's the same biosphere, you have the same species, and yet they're still cutting old growth trees. And I spent a week in the woods with Suzanne Simard, the eminent forest ecologist, looking with her field crew at what that does to an old growth forest and doing that by comparison. We went into soils to sample the soils in the old growth forests of BC that have not yet been cut and compared that to what we saw in these sun-baked clear cuts. And what we learned is that you're doing a kind of permanent damage when you clear cut a forest like that. You're losing this fructifying funk that is the next generation and ever more alive soil. Teresa Ryan from the Tsimshian Nation is a biologist in her lab, and we spent a lot of time talking about the connections between salmon and the forest. They are direct, they're scientific. To call these salmon forests is not just a metaphor, it's a fact. We talked about how, for instance, scientists can tell in a really big salmon return year by the color of the canopy with satellite imagery from space. The canopy is actually greener because of all that nitrogen and all that phosphorus that salmon have brought back to the forests in their bodies as they migrate home from the sea. You can actually see the signature of marine-derived nutrition in the microscopic detail of these trees. Isotopes that could only come from the marine environment. How did they get into the trees? They got there because wildlife, bears, mink, marten, raccoon, all the little varmints drag these carcasses into the forest, and there these carcasses decompose and they feed the soil, they feed the land, they feed the trees. And so you have this beautiful abundance, this self-sustaining cycle of life that, if left undisturbed, will continue forever. I spent a lot of time with the native people in British Columbia to learn about this cycle of life and the original systems of management, which were about sustaining these forests into the next generation, even though they were used. But they were used as a kind of permaculture. They would strip the bark for clothing, such as you see here, but only in one place, so the bark would continue to live on the rest of the tree, and the tree would abide to be used in that way for many generations. Maybe take a plank off a tree for a canoe or for a house, such as this ceremonial house, but just take it off the side and leave the rest of the tree. It would really only be for an ocean-going canoe that you would take the whole tree. And there was so much laughter and so much joy and so much courage that I witnessed when I was with these people of British Columbia talking about their forest and how, to them, success, management, there was successful management, meant a feast. It meant being able to put on a big feast for your village and many others with food from your home place. Many of the tribes are now seeking land back. They're trying to reclaim their right and title to places that their people were forcibly removed from during colonization, such as this grandmother, who just moved back to some logged over land in their home territory of the Monteguela First Nation. And they used the testimony of bark-scarred trees to prove their long presence on this landscape in court, and they won. So the trees were speaking of their management, of their caretaking of these trees for centuries before colonization occurred. This is Maine. After I had finished all that study and work of looking at the forests of the Pacific Northwest, I was at the Harvard Forest writing the manuscript for the book, and I said to Jonathan Thompson, now the director of the Harvard Forest, John, Where did this idea come from? So different from this original management system of caretaking the forest for the next generation, instead cutting it all down and sending it away to a distant market and putting the money in a bank. Where'd that come from? And he looked at me with this kind of, you don't know this look. And he said, Maine, the birthplace of industrial forestry in America. And I said, okay, I guess I'm going to Maine. So I did. And because I had a grant from the Harvard Forest, for which I'm still grateful, I rented a plane. And Jonathan and I went up and we looked at the landscape of the northern forest of Maine, which is 10 million acres, mostly privately owned. And most of it looks like this. It's been heavily managed, cut the trees so tiny. These are all about the size of a coffee can. And why? Why this heavy management? Why this heavy cutting even today? Well, for this. Maine was home to, for many, many years, the world's largest pulp mill operation, pulp and paper. And today, very sadly, from basically the Canadian border to the head of tide on the Penobscot River, you see things like this, these dead pulp mills in struggling towns that are trying to remake themselves after the pulp mill industry moved offshore, mostly to Asia, where it's cheaper and there's less environmental regulation. And so I was curious, all right, surely it isn't all like this. There must be places that are doing it better in New England. I wonder what the Penobscot tribe is doing with their forests. And they were kind enough to let me go out with their forester and the head of their natural resources department to look at their forest, which they cut. I mean, they cut it for the same reason everybody does, for money and jobs and material. But look how different. Again, retaining a different suite of life where you have deciduous trees, you've got conifers, you have young trees, old trees, lots of open areas. They were very careful with water. They used portable bridges, temporary bridges, rather than putting in culverts. And basically a very easy touch on the landscape. There was so much wildlife. We kept being interrupted by moose. It was pretty marvelous. And that was in February when there's not a lot out. And I thought, okay, that's a small tribe. How about commercially? Who's doing some commercial cutting that looks a little better, is easier on the land, and has more in mind than just profit? And that, when you're a writer and you're new, you're not really from the region, you don't know anybody, how do you make connections? Well, I went to the University of Maine and I told them what I wanted to know. And they said, oh, you need to meet Molly London, Logger of the Year. And so I thought, well, Molly's getting a call. And she and her husband were kind enough to let me come out and spend some time on their land, on the land that they were managing that day. And it was quite an eye-opener because for them, first of all, look how young they are, which is unusual in the logging industry. And theirs was a family-owned operation. And they had a small operation, but I would call it a really happy ship. The people who worked for them were really well paid, and they loved their jobs, and they were very highly skilled. And what they were doing was using this very sophisticated, very expensive equipment in order to basically do what's called pre-commercial thinning. They're going in and they're bringing back to life these sort of zombie forests that were very heavily and hard cut during the pulp mill years. And they were now being rehabilitated with this kind of restoration forestry, where you take out the little stuff and you actually leave the better, bigger stuff. And it was very interesting to me to see that and to recognize that when you say logging, logging is many things, and it can be a good thing and a helpful thing. It's all about where and how and what your motive is. Is it just profit, or is it to actually try to manage the forest for the future? I think the other thing that I found really inspiring when I was visiting in Maine was to see the fish passage work that's going on, just like out here. We're taking down dams in the Pacific Northwest in order to let fish come back to their places, their birth houses. Well, the same thing is happening on the Penobscot River. This, I call it a salmonator. That's not what they call it. It's basically an elevator to let anadromous fish, ocean-going fish, come over the dam, getting into this contraption and getting passed over to the other side. Also full-on dam removal, like this one. This was the site of VZ Dam on the Penobscot River. Well, look at it today. It's like the dam never happened. I sat there on the banks and listened to the current just rush over the rocks and heard the dippers calling and saw the shadbush in bloom. And you just think to yourself, nature, if you give it a chance, will come back. And we see this in New England everywhere with all the forests that have come back since the original clearing, all the animals that are back, and the rivers are coming back to life too. I think one of the things that was so inspiring to me in seeing these Atlantic salmon like this one was to recognize, as these big fish come back, as do the herring by the tens of millions, by the way, they too are feeding the land and bringing this landscape back to more like what it used to be. I went out with Sea Grant to get a sense of how the river itself is coming back to life. It was so polluted not that long ago, it literally turned colors. And what they were doing was using a sonogram kind of device to pick up how much biomass was in the water. And what they have seen is that year by year by year, there's more life, more herring, more shad. It's a beautiful thing to see a river come back to life. But I think one of the things that inspired me the most is how the people of New England and in Maine are reclaiming these rivers as their own and really welcoming home sea-run fish that they have not seen in a century. Suddenly, names of lakes like Silver Lake have a whole new meaning because herring are coming back by the many, many thousands. And people are really getting into this. The thing that I found really inspiring as I was looking for people with solutions was the work of the Appalachian Mountain Club. Now, the Appalachian Mountain Club has what they call their Maine Woods Initiative, and they are taking donations to acquire property. And they're doing three things with it. One is to set some of it aside for permanent conservation, just no touch. Another is recreational use. And the third thing is the kind of restoration logging that you saw Molly London and her husband working on. In fact, the Appalachian Mountain Club is their most important client. But the other thing the AMC is doing is this. They are helping to fund culvert replacement on all kinds of streams throughout the northern forest. And culverts really matter because when they're crushed or they're undersized, they block fish passage. Now, nobody cared about that for a very long time because there were main stem dams that were blocking the fish anyway. But now that those dams are being taken out and communities are also unblocking all sorts of other smaller streams to help fish get upstream to the original headwater forests, suddenly it really matters whether they're culverts or whether you have something beautiful like this, a bridge that's been built instead of a culvert so that fish, sea-run fish, can once again come back to the forest. And I really enjoyed this part of the reporting because the person who is doing a lot of this work that the AMC is paying for is Molly London's father-in-law. Now, the thing about this is, to me, this is where the magic happens. This is local people working locally with the skills they have from the work they've done all their lives, doing what needs to be done in order to make the rivers, the streams, and the forests whole again. And so this is one of his bridges that he put in with the field engineering skills that he had building the original logging roads. And he's so proud of these bridges that he signs each one with welding bead. So to me, that's about restoration on many scales. It's restoration of nature. It's also a restoration of our sense of our connection to these forests and what we can do to care for them and for the fish as well. So with that, that's the end of the slideshow I wanted to share with you, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation with Shelby. Shelby and I have had the pleasure of meeting in the woods for a walk during the Northeast Old Growth Conference this last summer, and so it's really fun for us to reconnect, and we're both eager for your questions as well. Hi, Shelby.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful and super interesting too. So just a reminder before your conversation starts to our guests on Zoom, questions may be submitted through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. I'll start asking your questions of Lynda and Shelby after their conversation. So if you have a question, please submit it at any time. So Lynda, the book begins, like you kind of told us about, in the old growth forests of the Pacific Northwest, discusses the salmon that nourish them, and then you write about the forests of the Northeast and the salmon that are only just beginning to recover, in our region. to start the conversation between you and Shelby, would you be willing to share what made you curious about the connections between the forest and the fish? And maybe something you learned that really surprised you?
Well, for me, I would say that it's just the overwhelming beauty of the genius of the connection. The fact that these forests shade the stream to keep it cool, and salmon are cold water animals. Anything over 55 degrees, they suffer, and if it gets up to 70, they will die. So the trees provide the shade. They hold the soil to which prevents erosion. And then the salmon, they feed the trees. And so it's this sort of circle of goodness that and the fact that that exchange of nutrients is also mediated by wildlife. I think anytime as a reporter, and I know Shelby, it must be this way for you too, when you see these connections between species, that just the sheer wonder and genius of that touches me very deeply. And the more I know, the more I want to know. How does that work? And
Yeah,
I think that's kind of how it started for me, was that sense of wonder.
I totally get that. I had a day, probably a couple years ago at our in the last couple years we protected a property. I don't remember the exact year that we called Tidal Bends in Maine, and it's on the Eastern River, I want to say. I might be getting that wrong. But we spent a day out there, a site visit early in the year, and there were so many fish. I think it was a herring run, but I'm not totally sure. We couldn't get a good look at any of the fish. We could just see fins, splashing through the water, and there were, I think we counted about a dozen bald eagles
Oh yeah.
just like posted up along the edge, and it was just a really incredible experience. Um, Thinking about that and actually about our walk at the Old Growth Conference, it probably won't surprise you to learn that one of my favorite parts of the book was the what is an old growth forest chapter where you talk about dead wood. And in that chapter, you compare a dead tree that is filled with life to a living tree that is actually mostly dead. And I wondered if you could share just a little bit more about that. I really loved how you framed it about how they are like alive in different ways. I wonder if there's more you want to say about deadwood from your research.
Yeah, I have to say this is one of my favorite parts of the work. I'm in fact contemplating a whole book about Deadwood now.
I
There's
can't
a
wait.
scientist, yeah, right, exactly. Talk about nerdy, right? There's a scientist out here who I adore. His name is Mark Harmon, Harmon, and he's at OSU. And he's devoted his whole career to Deadwood. We call him Dr. Death, actually. And Mark and I went out for a walk at the research forest down there in Oregon. It's called the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. And the fun of this was he stood in front of this beautiful cinnamon colored snag. It was about 10 feet over my head, and it was completely falling apart. There was just beautiful shards and pieces of dead wood on the ground, and it smelled that wonderful smell of cedar, wet cedar. And he stood there and he said, "Now, which is more alive?" And he pointed at this, and then he pointed at a living tree. And I said, "Well, that one, of course." He said, "Wrong." And the reason for that is because when a tree dies, and almost immediately life comes back to the log. And he expressed how this happens at every scale, from the microscopic to the birds we see flying in and banging their heads against the trees to get after the insects that are already infiltrating it. And so, as far as biomass goes, the dead one is way more alive than the so-called live one. And the live one is mostly dead. It's really just the cambium where the action is. And all the rest of it is heartwood and bark and all the rest. So, that was kind of a mind blower for me. And what you're really seeing in an old growth forest where all those stages of life are present is transubstantiation. It's not really death and it's not really life. It's just this continual evolution of cycles from the beginning of a tree's life to its next life, which is just feeding the soil and becoming the next tree. These nurse logs where all the little trees start their life, eventually that log just melts away into the soil and you see this colonnade of trees in a line. Well, that's how they got there. And then, of course, the trees are they're being transubstantiated into the bodies of fish and wolves and bears, and so it's a different way to think about a forest, and it's to me it's very beautiful, and it's kind of reassuring when we think about our own tiny little short mammalian lives. It's like, well, part of these much longer cycles.
Yeah, I will never forget on that walk we took this fall, when we found that little tiny salamander peeking out of a little hole in a piece of deadwood. That was such a lesson for me, especially because we were in a pretty lengthy drought at that point, and we found all the moisture in the dead wood on the forest floor, and everybody was just taking refuge in there. So it really highlighted how important they are, I feel like.
I agree. And Shelby, the other thing about that walk that was so magical to me, it was such a quote unquote ordinary place.
Hmm.
It was not a, old growth reserve. It was an absolutely ordinary logging road walk. And yet you were constantly pointing out wonders, whether it was slime molds, we spent a lot of time with those, or indeed the little salamander, the frogs, the wasp nests below ground. And the point to
Hmm.
me was the biodiversity, the enormous biodiversity that's sheltering in even in a so-called ordinary forest. There's no such thing as ordinary, is there?
They're all so important in their own ways.
Yeah.
And that is sort of a wonderful segue into my next question, which is about time, because time was such a reoccurring theme in the book, and it's something that I talk about a ton in my work, like tree time and just thinking on different time scales. And you just talked about our little mammalian lives. It's definitely a critical ingredient to developing so many features and functions of these old growth forests. And the clock can get reset so easily. And so I wonder, and this is sort of a philosophical question,
Mm.
I wonder if did writing this book change your relationship with time at all? And did thinking about time in this context change your relationship with these old forests in any way?
It did. I mean, I would say it actually made me more hopeful. And
Mm.
that might be surprising since a lot of the book is about damage and about logging and so forth. But honestly, it's the incredible regenerative capacity of nature. And that if the whole idea of better logging is keeping that capacity intact even when you're harvesting. You don't
Mhm.
take it all, you don't destroy the soil structure, you don't herbicide, you don't make a complex system simple. And nor do
Mhm.
you have the arrogance to think that you can just make a forest like the one you just took. Instead,
Mhm.
from a stance of humility and observation of how a forest actually works and is put together, you retain as much of those qualities as possible, even if you harvest. And if you do that, the forest comes back. It is never going to be like it was because nothing ever is. It transforms to something else, but neither will it be a dead zone like some of those pictures I showed you. And
Mhm.
so, I remain so inspired by New England. When I went to visit at the Harvard Forest and lived there basically for 2 different academic years, writing 2 different books, that place was cut to the ground, like everywhere in New England. And if you think about Thoreau, he was writing at the peak of deforestation in New England, and he lamented that the biggest, animal that he ever saw anymore was like a muskrat. And and that's because the trees were all gone and everything was all hunted out. Well, now look today, people are complaining about bear under the porch, and there are trees covering that landscape. Now you're starting to lose forests, and in Massachusetts, the leading cause of deforestation is solar development. So the path forward here, one of the reasons I love NEWT is because of your emphasis on forever wild and rewilding these places. And the reason for that is because, very simply, it works. That everywhere and every place where we give nature a chance to come back, whether it's dam removal or letting a forest come back to life, and sometimes it has to be helped out because it's been turned into a zombie forest with these industrial practices. So you need to open them up and let them kind of carry on, but it works. And I try to say this to people every time I speak publicly because it's so easy to think, oh, it's too late and everything's wrecked and it's blah blah blah, and it's so not true.
Mhm.
And the first people know this, right? I mean, they are fantastic repositories of knowledge and the fact that people aren't actually the problem. It's how we treat the landscape that is the problem. That people
Mm.
have always been part of these landscapes and even so-called wild places and taken care of them. So it is about shifting our mindset to a different relationship with nature, where it isn't just a commodity, something to just take and sell and move on. That's the thing that we all did when we first got here.
Mm.
But it wasn't how things were for many, many thousands of years, and it doesn't have to be that way now. We're very lucky. We have an incredible amount of land, the resources that we have in this country. I mean, I just look at New England, and the reforestation that's happened just because people walked away from the farms is one of the most important anywhere in North America. So the capacity is there. The capacity is there. It just needs to be given the chance.
I love that. I talk a lot about, yeah, rethinking our relationship with nature and thinking of it as more of a give and take relationship, more of a like how do we support each other, reciprocal type of relationship as opposed to a what can I get from you relationship? Because I think it's so important to love and care about these places and building that relationship and loving and caring about these places sort of leads to that natural better treatment and eventual better outcomes for forests. So thank you for what you do to say that to people and I'm doing it too.
You know,
um,
something Jerry Franklin said to me is that if you manage anything for only one value, it's never going to be a balanced or successful outcome. And with
mhm,
regard to industrial management, if you're only managing for profit margin for investors, no one should be surprised that we wind up with less than 40-year rotations and herbicided monocultures that really are never going to be a forest again. So it's about requiring better management that looks at water and carbon storage and wildlife and human well-being and more than just profit, which is the way it was before. So coming back to management systems that respect the complexity and capacities of these forests and cherishes that and preserves it even when they're used. And in other places, just going for full on rewilding and letting these long cadences of time play out, these time songs uninterrupted by us.
and I'll actually plug the work of which you talk about in the book of some friends and colleagues of mine called Beyond the Illusion of Preservation, which was a report that was really about, and I love how you called this out in the book, about not only sort of changing our relationship with wood products and what we, if we're going to harvest our forests, making sure that we're getting higher quality and better wood products out of them and better jobs for the people working in them and also better outcomes for our forests. But it also talks about reducing use and thinking about our own relationships with consumption, which I think is a really important and often missing piece in these conversations, is reducing our consumption and finding ways to reuse and be more thoughtful consumers.
Absolutely right. And that's not something that's called out very often because our economy is built on consumption.
Mhm.
The idea of shrinking it down, that was very popular in the 70s. I remember it well, and it's kind of been blown up and gone away to an economy of convenience and more and more and more, and nature just cannot sustain that, not with 8.5
Mm.
billion people.
Yeah, and I um, I think it's interesting to think about the work of all these scientists over the years and everything we've learned from them, and almost that sort of arc that you're talking about where we're coming back almost to original knowledge of how to interact with the forest. And I loved in your book following all these different scientists through the forests and learning what they are learning and what they've learned since Jerry Franklin really started this work in the 70s. As you know and have mentioned, I'm a really big fan of like little tiny things in the forest, slime molds and fungi and all the little goodies. And I think there's still so much to learn there. And I wonder, after your research, what do you see as some of the most important sort of open questions around understanding old growth forests and forests in general?
I think there's some really good questions about forests and climate, and
Mm,
and how now that we've created a different climate, what are we going to do? I mean, the thing that strikes me, especially in New England as well, is all the invasive species. I mean, the forests we've created and the climate we've created cannot coexist in the sense that we have these hot droughts now that are pulling moisture out of the forest. They're more fire prone, more drought prone. We have this global commerce that's bringing in pests from all over the world, and we're not at all doing the phytosanitary discipline that we need to do to protect our forests. And you combine that, it's like this combined threat to our forests. And I do not think we've done the work we need to do with regard to invasive pests. And we have the research. The Harvard Forest put out some really good research about what you need to do with regard to phytosanitary protections, both in the shipping chain, and it takes money, and it
Mhm.
takes doing it. This is not news. This is as old as Dutch elm disease, but particularly in the Northeast, well, I mean, we're losing entire species, and there's nothing else that's doing that. Logging isn't doing that. That's
Right.
global commerce unchecked and the invasion of these pests, and we're losing, the iconic species of our forests, from eastern hemlock to ash. It's this slow moving
Mhm.
catastrophe. There are no flames, there are no chainsaws, so it doesn't have the drama of these other environmental issues that it's people in a funny way don't see it, they don't hear it, they're not really tuned into it the way they are the other things. So I think a place where more knowledge is needed, and frankly just more work is bugs and
Mhm.
disease, and then how our forests are going to be climate protected. I mean, we're losing so many trees in protected areas. So yes, protect, save, plant, but it's not going to help you if they're getting taken out by the next pest or if it all burns up. So it's we have to deal with climate change. We have to deal with our carbon emissions, period. We have to build safety systems for the natural world into our now completely global commerce. So we've changed how we live on this planet, and that is affecting the natural world, even apart from our need to protect more of it. We need to make sure what we've got can live.
Mhm. Yeah, I think, if I remember correctly, beech leaf disease had not really become a big thing here at the time that this book was written. You talk about beech bark disease and emerald ash borer and hemlock woolly adelgid, but
Right.
we're now dealing with beech leaf disease, which is just such a fast killer. I mean, these trees are dead in 2 to 3 years, and the first year all the leaves are dead, and it's very hard to watch. So I think we're every day dealing with the repercussions of not taking these precautions. These are the externalized costs of a global economy that are
Exactly.
coming to bear for us specifically and for our forests and for everything that depends on them. I mean, we talk about bears being back in the forest. Well, beech trees are such a key food tree for bears, and to lose our beech is it's pretty devastating to think about. And I mean, I think we're looking down the barrel of a future with very few mature beech trees left in it.
Wow. Yeah, we experienced a little of that when I was out with the Harvard Forest researchers. We were in forests that were completely protected in the Adirondacks, and they
Hmm.
were in an advanced stage of decline. We went to go see a beautiful old growth forest in New York, and it was being accessioned into the old growth forest network, and I was there for the celebration, and that was just absolutely joyful. But it was a little weird, Shelby, because there were no mature beech.
Yeah.
There's weren't any. So this is up to us. We have to fix that.
There's this Aldo Leopold quote that you probably know. One of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds.
I
That
do know.
one,
Do
that
know.
one gets me every time.
Uh,
But now I think we're less lonely in that world. More and more people are aware, more and more people are paying attention, and hopefully more and more people are doing things about it. I recently watched a talk by Sean Fravor, who's from the University of Maine, about deadwood, which was really fascinating. And he had done some work in Europe and said that they had identified 7,000 plus species that are that require deadwood for part of their life cycle. And I
Oh,
said, wow, that's incredible. I feel like there's that here, but we just don't know what they are. And we started talking about how there's actually like just taxonomy, particularly of insects, is kind of a dying art. And there's my colleague Jason told me there's a red list of taxonomists
mhm.
where, these people are the only people in the world, perhaps, who know this genus or whatever it is, this group of insects well enough to get them down to species. And when we lose those people, we lose so much of what we know. And I think about that a lot in relationship to old growth forests. We have so few of them left, and there's so much happening in them. And there are so few people and less funding in science who actually get the opportunity to understand them and spend time in them. And you've just gotten to spend a whole bunch of time with some of the greatest minds in this world. Um, and I think you do a beautiful job of winding hopefulness through the book. And I know you just said that you came away with hope, but I wonder if you could share some other things that gave you hope that you learned in your work.
Absolutely. I mean, I would call my stance one of practical optimism, and
Mm,
it's informed by the revivals that I have with my own eyes seen, whether it's dam removal on the Elwha River of Washington State, or the Vesey Dam in the Penobscot River, or the reforestation of New England. Um, Nature comes back, but I want to give a shout out for the things people can do, because there are a lot of things people can do, from supporting organizations like yours in order to preserve more open spaces forever, to rewild this beautiful earth. That's number one. Support local NGOs that are working on natural history and wildland preservation and scientific research. Um, I would also say that I really want to give a shout out to people like you, Shelby, the naturalists of our world. I mean, this is a lost art. A lot of people have grown up without knowing their plants, knowing their birds, knowing the cycles of the seasons. This used to be taught in public schools. This used to be things that people kept track of in their own gardens, on their own farms. We call it phenology. This is the study of the seasons. And it's very interesting. It's really having a rebirth now. In climate science, a lot of the records that scientists are looking at to see the fingerprint of climate change on the land are farmers' journals or logs kept by skating clubs of when the ice came, or when did the daffodils bloom. And I want to give a shout out for this. The word amateur comes from love. For this love of place, know your home place. If you don't have a regular practice of a sit spot where you go out and you keep track of your home ground wherever that is, and you pay attention to when the birds come and which ones they are, and you know the names of your native plants, and you have kids that you go out in the woods with to teach this to, this is literacy. And it has been largely lost, and to the effect we do not know and love our local natural places, we won't take care of them. We won't fight for them. And so it starts with knowledge, and it starts with love, and it starts to connection, and it starts with local place. And there are everywhere places where you can get involved, whether it's taking out invasive weeds or it's planting trees. There are building bird boxes. There are, through NGOs and clubs all over New England and all over the Pacific Northwest, places to plug in, care, get connected, and make a difference. And to me, that's also just such a source of joy in life. And when I think some of the things that I most enjoyed in working on this book was, of course, just being outside, being in
mhm.
trees, climbing a tree. I mean, I had help, I had special gear, but get up into a tree again. It's probably been a while. You'll see it differently. You'll see life differently.
Mm. I love that. This feels like a very natural place for me to do a little plug for a NEWT event that's coming up.
There you go.
My colleague Jason and I are going to lead a nature journaling group starting in the middle of March, going to the middle of April. You can find out about it on our website. So if you want to practice looking at phenology and spending time just paying attention to your home landscape, consider checking that out and signing up. We'll be sending prompts and what to look for and things like that to sort of guide people through starting a nature journaling practice. Um, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I think we might shift towards some audience questions. I think the the one of the things that really stood out for me in your book, I guess I feel a little bad coming back to this because I really wanted to end on that hopeful note, but I'm going to come back to the paper companies and the woods of Maine and I flagged a quote here that was much of what was needed in life came from the Maine woods. And that really sort of stuck with me about just sort of that history of how, yeah, just before plastic, like all of our needs came from the forest, basically. And the forest paid the price in a lot of ways. And that legacy is still there. And I wonder if you have thoughts about you tell a story of seeing the same name of a family, uh,
Oh,
logging family, and that started in the east and then moved to the west and sort of brought those practices out there. And um, not to go too deeply, but I think there were also sort of similar practices that involved the disenfranchisement of the indigenous people
yep,
that started on this coast and moved to that coast. And
yep.
um, I'm just curious about some of the lessons you took away from that and some of the, I don't know, sort of light bulb moments of learning those connections. That was really interesting to me.
Yeah, to me, that was wild to be walking across a bridge in Machias, Maine, and see a plaque to this family that I know this family and I know their land and I know the sawmill that just got shut down and hauled away. It was the longest operating sawmill in the Pacific Northwest, and they came over here on a sailboat and set it all up over here after cutting it all down in Maine. So that was kind of a hammer blow. It's like, oh, that's great. And now it's still going on in BC. So I guess I would say that for me, it's kind of it's time to stop this moment. It was like, all right, so we've gone through this phase of colonization and exploitation, and this needs to be the era of restoration. And
Mm,
restoration is kind of a funny word. You're never going to put it back like it was, but we can learn and we can be taught by the trees themselves about what needs to happen now. And they're really it's pretty clear that we can't keep on this course. I think that's pretty obvious. And it now is up to us to begin a new relationship with our forests that's going to be beyond commodification to reciprocity. And I think that we're very fortunate because the first people are still here to help guide and educate that recalibration. And we're all here together now, right? I mean, the settler colonists aren't going back, and the first people are still here. So it's all about how we take care of this place together. And again, people aren't the problem; it's the management that has exploited the landscape that is the problem, and even one another, obviously.
mhm,
So
mhm.
it's it's about a reset that is deeper than just whether you log or you don't log. It's about something much deeper than that. It's about our relationship with nature and with one another, and
Mhm.
taking responsibility for this place. Not just taking what you want for you and moving on to the next place to go get more. So, in that way, the book for me, it was about a lot more than trees. It was
Yeah.
about how we live here, and in that way that this title that the trees are speaking to me, that's really what they're saying. you know Enough
Mhm.
is enough. Enough is enough. And I am hopeful, as I said, because when we make those changes, however small, life comes back. It really does, and with it comes so much more. It comes a changed and better relationship. So the book for me, it was it was a journey of connecting the histories, this
Mm.
arc of history, and understanding that this coast to coast thing is it's really been this unplanned experiment that's been going on for 500 years, and we certainly know the outcome at this point. We know that we have our answers. It's important to keep doing science, but we also don't want to just keep learning more and more about less and less. We kind of know the big picture of what we need to do in terms of stop spewing carbon without restraint and stop the undoing, and start fixing and don't break any more. One of the best things I heard was from one of the lessons that stayed with me came from one of my friends at the Harvard Forest, and she said the following. What does a good guest do in a home? What does a good guest do? Well, the first thing is don't break anything. The
First
next
rule.
thing, right? Don't break anything. Number two, bring a gift.
Mm.
Right? Number three, look for ways to be helpful. Well, that's really our relationship on this planet. We're guests. So quit breaking things, give back, and look for ways to be helpful. Clary's Heart, Harvard Forest. Couldn't have said it better myself.
I love that.
Yeah,
It
that's
feels
really
like
beautiful.
the sum up is in my head the sum up is the trees are speaking. Are we listening? Are we ready to listen? Like it's time to listen.
So that
Thank you so much. This is a really interesting conversation. We do have some questions, and so I'll just we're kind of all over the map, all over the forest. So now this first one would take up the whole question and answer period, but I know you'll just be able to say something, which is I'd be interested to know about the role of beavers in old growth forests.
oh, I'm so glad somebody brought up beavers. Beavers do it better, no matter what it is that needs to be done on a landscape. Beavers do it better, and their extirpation, when we all showed up and kicked them out, that's one of the most important changes on the land, and it affected the hydrology of our landscape everywhere. So, you know, in an old growth forest, what there are a lot of things missing. Whether you're talking about yours or ours, wolves, right? The big predators have been largely extirpated, and that makes a really big difference because it affects everything from the suite of vegetation to the other animals that are abundant and how they behave. And the other thing largely missing is the beavers. So in a place like an old growth forest, what are they going to do? Well, first of all, they're going to be fat and happy because they got plenty of wood to chew on, but they're going to make their wonderful dams, which stoppers up streams and creates ponds, which is just heaven for salmon. Because then they have all these little side channels and quiet little ponds and places to be. And the little ones, by the way, they just go right through the sticks of a dam. It's really not a problem for them. But this idea that we had to blow them all up to make room for the fish was crazy talk. And so that's what they do. They rehydrate the landscape. They keep it nice and wet and slopping with all kinds of ponds and little rills and streams and their dams. You got to realize they were everywhere by the millions. And so when you take them out, obviously that's going to have a huge effect on the landscape. And a lot of it is you just don't have connection anymore between the streams and the rivers and their floodplains because they've cut down and they've eroded such that the streams and the rivers cannot access the floodplain anymore. And so it needs to be rehydrated and reconnected. And sometimes that actually takes heavy equipment to reset it. This is called zero stage restoration, where you come in and just kind of put it back so it can function and get these animals back on the landscape. We have a big, all kinds of programs out here where we are tribally run, some of them, others not, relocating problem beavers from suburban settings, putting them out where they can do their good work elsewhere. So it's beavers do it better.
So when you were talking about that, you mentioned the missing carnivores, and somebody actually does have a question here. Can you talk about the role of cougars in salmon forests?
Hmm. One of the beautiful things on the Ilwa River in Washington State is captured on the wildlife cam is a cougar eating a coho. So what's exciting to me about that is the dam removals on the Ilwa River, which is in the Olympic National Park mostly. They were done for fisheries restoration. They were done to bring back the 5 species of salmon that used to barnstorm that river. But with the salmon come the animals because they feed everything. And so it was so exciting to me to begin to see that restoration reaching into these other aspects of the different wheels of life, including feeding the carnivores. And so seeing that cougar snagging a coho and dragging it off into the woods, I thought, oh my God, that's fantastic. It's all starting up again, that cycle of nutrition. So cougars, like bears, are completing the circle. They're the mediators. They're bringing the nitrogen and that phosphorus from the sea onto the land, and they're feeding the soil and they're feeding the trees. So that cycle of life, that beautiful completion, it's mediated by wildlife. So those animals have a job to do, and if they're not there, they can't do it. Cougars, I have a special love for them. They're an amazing animal. They're so incredibly athletic, just so graceful, so important on the landscape. There's a very beautiful project out here underway to try to protect them and put them back in places where they aren't. Panthera is trying to do this. I wonder if I can talk about this. Maybe it's a secret. Panthera is a global cat organization, and they're, let's just put it this way, they're active, and they're trying to restart the cougar situation where it can be restarted. Man, when I was driving around Maine, and in fact, when I was driving to come out to your East Coast Old Growth Conference, so I'm driving from Massachusetts to Vermont, and I'm looking at the landscape, and I'm thinking, God, if I was a cougar, I'd live here.
It does seem like it's just screaming for them.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Shelby, this is probably more directed for you. There's a question, is there any old growth forest in the McGalloway project land that NEWT will own?
Oh, that's a great question. We have not ground verified anything yet, but we have heard rumors of probably mature forest, maybe not old growth, but certainly old forest on the sort of top backside of Rump Mountain. Um, I've heard talk about it from other ecologists who've gone out and seen it, but they haven't cored any trees. So it's sort of just a place with more structure that we are aware of. We hope to get out there to sort of field verify it sometime this summer, hopefully, and learn more about it. But not a lot because a lot of that property was previously used for industrial timber production. So, it bears a lot of scars on the landscape that can be seen in the satellite imagery. But there are certainly patches of that older forest. And as part of that project, there will be some stream restoration work that will be about sort of rebuilding those connections between the forest and the stream, pulling out non-functioning culverts and things like that. And a lot of times in those properties, like the McGalloway, the most intact pieces of the forest because of the BMPs in Maine are alongside the streams. So hopefully we have enough sort of scattered patches of old forest to sort of seed the recovery of the rest of that landscape. This is a project, Lynda, I don't know if you've heard about, that's about 11,000 acres that NEWT is in the process of purchasing. It's part of a much larger partnership. There will be conservation easements with our partners on much more land around it. I'm not going to say numbers because I don't know them by heart and I don't want to get them wrong, but we've got, I think, Forest Society of Maine, Rangeley Lakes Heritage Trust, and the Nature Conservancy in Maine all working together on this big collaborative project to protect a bunch of land, home of the last stand of caribou in Maine that are gone now, but were there. So very
Yeah.
remote territory that we're gonna rewild.
Congratulations. That's very exciting.
Very
I'll be a
exciting.
cougar.
Future cougar home.
Bring two.
Oh,
So while we're on the subject of Maine, somebody has asked, are there currently any old growth forests in Maine that have Atlantic salmon returning to spawn?
I don't think so, but I'm saying it slowly like that because I'm not 100% sure. I'd be super doubtful of that. On the Penobscot, you got 1,000 approximately, and that's a tiny number. I don't think so. What you have, though, is potential. There's still a lot more dam removal that needs to be done on the Penobscot. Um, the thing that's coming back like crazy are herring. It's exciting. There's like 10 million of them coming back now. And I'm sure, Shelby, that what you saw that day were herring. There's so many, they're loud.
Yeah, yeah.
And watching the herring come back is so much fun because it's just like you described. They're all these little fins, and oh man, they have this animal determination. You look at them as they're heading upstream, and you just haven't ever seen a face like that. It's very exciting, and that was a nothing burger. 10 years ago, there was nothing happening. So it's just so important to recognize the capacity of nature if given the chance to access their home places. So, you know, there's not much old growth in Maine, period, straight up. And so I'd be surprised if those two have found each other yet, but give it time. Give it time. Don't give up and keep making connections. It's all about the connections. Watersheds, right? It's watershed scale management, and that's what'll make the difference.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions about logging. One of them is, I keep hearing a forest has to be managed. Our county forester was all about cutting and logging to create old growth forest.
Yeah.
What about just leaving it alone? No
Yeah.
one managed Vermont forests until less than 200 years ago, and they did just fine. So is that a viable, like, I'm sure you both have thoughts on that?
I do. I mean, it depends on the condition of the forest. If it's a healthy forest, yeah, what does it need you for in terms of getting in there and doing stuff? Absolutely right. If the thing is a zombie forest, that is to say it was all cut down and it's dense dog hair, dark, no food in there, no light reaching the understory, monoculture, that's a forest that really can't be abandoned at this point. It needs a reset or it can't get back to being a forest again. So it totally depends on what we're talking about. And I would say that is generally true about forest management. It's never one thing in any place. It's always site specific. What, where, how, and for what are the key questions, in addition to who's doing it, because it does take skill, attention, money to do it right. So if it's a healthy forest, but for heaven's sakes, let it continue on and do what it knows how to do best. If it's been simplified to a point of no return, then intervention is going to be necessary, or it really can't reset itself. Maybe it could eventually over an extremely long time period, but it really would take a very long time.
Yeah, I think that's the piece I was going to add is just I think any forest has the capacity to regenerate on its own. It just depends on what time scale you're talking about.
Mhm.
So those really, really damaged forests that Linda's talking about, the zombie forest, I mean, at one point, much of the Northeast was under a mile of ice and the forest came back. So I think the forests can come back. It's just whether or not we want to wait 1,000 years. And so there are places where humans will do some work to get things started, sort of just a jump start, and that I think is particularly useful in landscapes that where you need to do some management anyway, where you have management goals as a landowner. If you want to get some wood products off there, if you want to get some money out of it, if you're going to be managing it moving forward, and your goals are a healthy forest and getting some wood products, there's lots of great ways to apply forestry to both help improve the structure of the forest and get some value out of it. And then there's, the rewilding route where you just let things go. It really comes down to your goal for the land. I mean, Northeast Wilderness Trust, everything we buy, we're just sort of trusting the rewilding route. We are not doing any of that upfront management. We let it go. A lot of our forests are in at least moderately good shape, still standing trees and things like that. Some of them have patches that are pretty heavily managed. This is part of why the work that I'm doing with my program, we're doing long-term forest management or long-term forest monitoring plots where we're sort of trying to capture what happens when you ignore it and how long it takes to recover. Because I think there are open questions about that. I think it's, the science of forest succession is not that old. And a lot of it came from old field abandonment starting in the Northeast. And when we are sort of applying that to the forests we have now, I think there's sort of some different baseline conditions sometimes. So, yeah, measuring what happens when you abandon a forest and abandon, I say, but I don't mean we're abandoning it. We're taking care of them and letting them be wild, but measuring what happens during that process, I think is really important because we might find that maybe it's not always necessary in places where we think it is, or maybe there are places where it's definitely necessary, where it's going to take a very, 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 very long time to recover. And so, yeah, I think that's the beauty of Wildlands, right? We're the comparison, we're the control in the experiment that is the rest of sort of the matrix of land use types. And so we're going to do nothing in every scenario at Northeast Wilderness Trust, and we're going to measure and see what happens and learn from that. And then other landowners are going to do what matches up with their goals.
Thank you both for weighing in on that. So we've got a question from somebody in southern New England who's saying, can you comment on your experience on importance of size of core forest area in suburban/urban environments? Here in southern New England, it's a struggle to patch together larger preserves.
Right. Yeah, connectivity, right? It's all about connectivity so that animals can move the way they need to move, so that seeds can travel and create more forest. It's all about connectivity. I mean, I would say, first of all, I'll take any tree I can get. I'll take any patch I can get. It all counts. And because I live in a city, I'm particularly sensitive to this. These side yards that get the trees whacked so you can make more money off the property by subdividing it and so forth. Ask the birds if every tree matters. I think they would say yes. So, in terms of, is there a magic number? It has to be this big to matter. Otherwise, it's too small and it doesn't really count. I mean, obviously, bigger's better. And I always want more, but I would say it all counts. And whatever you can get it and keep it. And if you can, connect it to the next one. And create more, plant. But don't just plant trees, grow them. Make sure you take care of them. Come back and take care of them. I think that there's no magic number, half an acre, 20 acres. I don't think there's a magic number. First of all, it would depend on what you're going for. Are you trying to create, a big enough forest that it can support carnivores and those sorts of interactions? Or are you just trying to have something really essential, which is green space for kids to play? It all counts, and it's anything you can get, you ought to get it and take care of it. And if you can make it bigger and connect to another hunk, go for it.
Yeah, I'll second all of that and say, I always say wilderness works on many scales, and there's this old sort of seminal literature that says 5,000 acres is the minimum size for all the functions of wilderness. And I always kind of push back on that a little. 5,000 acres is wonderful and great, and totally get it where you can, but don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. When you have land that you can protect, there are some subset of those functions that you're going to get at every scale. And for some beings, like salamanders, their whole world might be an acre or less. And so protecting an acre or less is going to save the lives of everybody who uses that acre or less, and the birds. To the birds, every tree matters. So, I don't think there's a minimum size in my mind. There's a just just building on what we have, protecting what we have. If you like the wildlife that's around you now, protect the wild land that's around you now, because that's who relies on it and that's what they need. And yeah, wherever you can, let some little edges go wild. Don't mow the edges of your yard and, let some little patches go wild and get thick and brambly and messy. Everybody abhors a mess. People abhor a mess, but nature loves it. So make some messes.
Oh, I just love that. I'm going to put that on a shirt. I love that. Right
That's
before I got on this call, I was out in our garden and, spring is happening here already. And I was watching this bumblebee the size of a teddy bear. This thing was enormous and fuzzy and fat. And it was enjoying the crocuses, but it was getting cooler because it was, beginning to come into the end of the day. And so, you know what it did? I watched it snug into this oregano plant that I cut down, and I was thinking not 3 weeks ago, I was thinking, I should take that thing out. And I watched it go to bed in the oregano, and I thought, oh my God, it's it's big and it's a mess and it's staying. It's Bumblebee Hotel. I didn't know it was a Bumblebee Hotel, but it is. So there you go.
Well, let's see. I think I can ask one or two more. So this person writes, this is a devil's advocate kind of question. If there are potentially thousands of species we don't even know about in the deadwood of our forests, why should we be concerned about a single species that happens to be large and iconic, like beech? Maybe all will be well in the big picture. Is that burying my head in the sand or is it optimism?
Hmm. Well, I mean, let's hope. I don't know. I'm one of those people where when you put something back together and there's a piece left over on the floor, I think, oh, this probably isn't going to work out really well. It was probably important if it was there before. I feel that way about species too. Beech, I'm sure they matter. I hope all will be well. It's certainly true that there's a lot out there we don't even know about whether it ever existed. So we don't know that we even lost it. No doubt about it. You're right about that. But man, to me, it's all about the cautionary principle of do no harm, knowing that we know so little, actually. And I don't know about you, but as I get older, I'm pretty sure by now I don't know anything at all. Whereas if you talked to me when I was 20, I knew everything. So that's kind of how it goes. The more you know, the more you realize you don't know. So I go for the cautionary principle. Assume it matters because it probably does in ways you don't even understand.
Mm. Yeah, I think a lot about when we talk about those big charismatic species and possibly losing them. Um, I mean, I think every species matters, right? If we have 7,000 species in the deadwood that we don't even know about, that we could lose if we keep treating our forests like industrial paper companies. But this is one we know about. And so don't we have a responsibility to be thoughtful about both the things we know about and the things we don't know about? Don't we have some duty as denizens of this planet, as residents of these forests, to care about these big charismatic beings? And by the way, the bigger and the more charismatic it is, the more likely it is to have a zillion interactions with everything below. So that makes them really important too. I'm not one to try to build a hierarchy of species and be like, these are the important ones we should save and everybody else doesn't matter. But I think like beech trees, I worry about them a lot because so many things depend on them, and so much of the balance of life, starts with that food chain and those nuts that are made by beech trees, and that cycle can be disrupted, losing a species like that. And I also worry about every single one of those 7,000 little species that we don't know because I just care about them too, and I'm worried about them too. I want them to live too. So I don't know. I'm hopeful in weird ways, like that. Elm trees died from Dutch elm disease, and we still have them in a sort of lessened capacity in our forests. American chestnuts, we still have in this sort of stunted capacity, root sprout and stuff in our forests. And I'm hopeful that we'll still have beeches in that way, and we'll still have hemlocks in that way. And the thing that gives me hope, it's not for my lifetime, it's not for any of us here today, but there are papers and pollen core research that shows that hemlock actually disappeared for a significant period of the pollen record
Right.
in the distant history, and it has recovered. So when these species are able to hang on in some vestige of their former glory, and these evolutionary processes play out on evolutionary timescales. So again, not something any of us will see. But if we protect the land, if we protect places, if we care about places, there's a chance they can recover at some point in the future because we've made a place for them, because we've cared about them now. And so I have to care about all these things now, even if it's tearing me apart, because I have to believe that someday they'll be able to thrive again and that we can build the future where they can thrive.
That's so well said, because ultimately it is about providing refugia, the places where these recoveries can play out. And we can't know how that will happen, but one thing we know for sure is if it's paved, it's not happening. So that's why landscape protection at every scale, everywhere it can be, is going to make the difference for biodiversity and ultimately for human well-being.
A beautiful place as we approach the end of our Q&A, and not to be plagiarizing Ezra Klein here, but I am curious, for either of you or both of you, are there any books that really touched you and helped you see, especially consider your relationship with nature? Rewilding the Heart comes to mind for me, but I imagine so much has been written, about the land ethics since Aldo Leopold coined the term, and maybe, you can think on your feet and recommend some titles to us in the audience. It's that importance of making that connection and that kind of shift in our thinking to
You know,
being good.
I can answer this very easily. When I read the North Maine Woods, Thoreau's book, The Maine Woods, that was a transformational book for me. I read a lot of Thoreau, but I hadn't read him on Maine, and Maine scared him. It was a little too big and wild and scary for him. But to read his accounting of the transformation that he was witness to, he was watching it happen all around him. Um, it was a very important book for me, both in terms of what he saw and the transformation that he saw around him, and his lamentation about people's limited appreciation for instance, a pine tree. That why can they not see the worth of the living pine? They can only see the planks. And anyway, I found that a very beautiful book. And if you haven't read it, you've got a treat in store. And it just makes you realize this process of transformation has been underway for a very long time. Um, and this need to change our relationship with nature and think about it differently than just a commodity has been there a long time.
I'm going to give three books. And the first one is Lynda's book
Yeah.
because I really enjoyed reading this book and I loved the comparison of my sort of home forests of the Northeast and thinking about those forests of the Pacific Northwest, which I've always dreamed about but have never been to see myself. So I'm going to highly recommend that book, especially to people who live in the Northeast, just because a lot of familiar names, a lot of familiar places. It felt really some of the things in it were sort of surprising new ways of looking at places that I was pretty familiar with already. So highly recommend, really enjoyed that. The second book I'm going to talk about is To Speak for the Trees by Diana Beresford Kroger, which I just really love that book. She's I think a plant chemist or plant biologist, and she learned a lot of traditional knowledge from her like Celtic wisdom growing up in Ireland, I believe, and then she went on to like find all the science behind it and say, yes, this is all real and there's real value in it, and sort of stand up and be a voice for a lot of people who were not taken very seriously by some of Western science. And I really appreciated that perspective. So the trees are speaking and To Speak for the Trees both sort of fit together in my head, and I really liked both of those books. And then the last one, I'm totally stealing from my coworker, Jason, who recommended to me, shout out Wildlands ecologist Jason Mazurowski, which was Annie Proulx's Bark Skins.
Oh, yeah.
Have you read that, Linda?
Yeah, it's a tough read. It's very painful, but it's very good.
It's
Yeah.
very painful. It's a very
Uh,
long journey through the sort of settler colonial times, all the
Catastrophe.
way up to very close to modern day. Very painful. But it takes place in the forests of eastern Canada and Maine, and then sort of expands around the world and really follows this timber industry that you talk about some in your book. And I found myself thinking about that book a lot while I was reading this book, because I felt like I had almost experienced some of this through
Yeah.
that. And I listened to it on audiobook on a very long road trip, so I was like really in it.
Oh, boy. Yeah.
That was great.
Those are my three books.
Wow. Okay, well, it's time for us to start wrapping up. So, on behalf of everybody, who's joined online, thank you both so much for making the time to be here and thoughtfully answering so many questions. We did have even more questions. Um, so that's just been great. And to everyone who's participated on Zoom, thank you for showing up tonight. It's wonderful to have a great turnout. Your questions are really good. And on behalf of Northeast Wilderness Trust, our sincere thanks for your care and concern for wild creatures and wild places, and for spending an evening with us. The slide lets you know that attendees will be sent a post-event email with information on the webinar recording and other things happening at NEWT. There's a link to the Forever Wild Circle we talked about, and hopefully we'll see you back for our last installment of this spring's speaker series, which will be A Biologist's Eye, Cultivating Curiosity in Our Backyards. So kind of right on what you touched on in your conversation tonight, and that'll be April 21st. So if you'd like to learn more about Northeast Wilderness Trust and about Lynda Mapes' work, our websites are right here on the bottom of the slide. And thank you, Lynda and Shelby, so much for being here tonight.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.